Ryan Cooper stood at the edge of the landing platform watching the last transport ship disappear into the orange sky, and his heart felt heavy because 3 years of war had finally ended, but he had nothing left to return to, and the silence around him was almost worse than the sounds of battle he had grown used to. The settlement looked different now, with half the buildings in ruins and scorch marks on the walls, telling stories of the invasion that had nearly destroyed everything, and the few people walking through the streets moved like ghosts, avoiding eye contact because everyone had lost someone, and no one wanted to talk about it anymore. He picked up his duffel bag and started walking toward the old district where he used to live before the military recruited him and trained him to fight aliens who wanted to strip mine entire planets for resources. And back then, he had a small apartment and a job at the mechanics shop, and life was simple, even if it was not exciting. But when he reached his old street, he found nothing except rubble and broken concrete and twisted metal beams pointing at the sky like accusing fingers, and his apartment building was gone completely, as if it had never existed, and he stood there for a long time trying to remember what his front door looked like. A cold wind blew through the ruins carrying dust and the smell of old fires, and Ryan pulled his jacket tighter and decided there was no point standing around feeling sorry for himself, because he was alive, and that was more than many of his friends could say. He remembered hearing about refugee camps in the abandoned sector where people had hidden during the worst bombings, and maybe someone there would know what happened to the few possessions he had left behind, or at least point him toward temporary housing, until he figured out what to do with the rest of his life. The walk took almost an hour because he had to climb over debris and navigate around collapsed streets, and twice he saw patrol drones flying overhead, making sure no looters were taking advantage of the destruction, and he wondered if they ever got tired of watching over a dead city. When he finally reached the abandoned sector, he was surprised to see how intact some of the buildings were, and apparently this area had been spared the worst of the fighting, because it was too far from the military installations that the invaders wanted to destroy. There were still people living here in temporary shelters made from salvaged materials, and he saw children playing in what used to be a marketplace, and old women cooking over small fires, and men repairing walls with whatever they could find. Ryan walked through, slowly looking around and trying to get his bearings, when he heard a sound that made him freeze because it was unlike anything he had encountered before, and it was musical and powerful, and it seemed to vibrate in his chest. He turned toward the sound and saw her standing in an open courtyard surrounded by broken fountains and cracked statues, and she was tall and graceful with silver skin that seemed to glow in the fading sunlight, and her ears were pointed like the aliens from old Earth stories, and her eyes were luminous, like twin moons. She wore armor made from overlapping scales that shifted from blue to green to purple, depending on how the light hit them, and at her side stood 2 creatures that made his breath catch in his throat, because they were clearly dragons, but not like the massive beasts from ancient legends. These dragons were sleek and elegant, standing about waist-high with long necks and intelligent eyes that watched him with curiosity, and their scales were darker than their mistress armor, ranging from deep midnight blue to black with hints of silver along their spines. One of the dragons made that musical sound again, and the woman turned to look directly at Ryan, and her gaze was intense and searching, as if she could see right through him, to measure what kind of man he was. Ryan raised both hands slowly in a gesture of peace, because he had learned during the war that sudden movements could get you killed, and he called out in the common trade language that most species understood, asking if she needed help or if she was lost. The woman tilted her head, studying him for a long moment before she spoke, and when her voice came, it had that same musical quality he had heard before, and she said her name was Lyra, and she was not lost, but rather she had been waiting. Ryan lowered his hands slowly and took a few careful steps closer, and he asked what she meant by waiting, and who exactly was she waiting for in the ruins of a human settlement that barely anyone visited anymore. Lyra smiled, and it transformed her face from beautiful to absolutely breathtaking, and she explained that she was a Lori, and her people were guardians of ancient treasures scattered across many different worlds, and during the war, her ship had been damaged and crashed on this planet. She had been stranded here for almost a year, hiding from both the invading forces and from treasure hunters who would kill her to get what she protected, and her dragons, whose names were Storm and Shadow, had kept her safe, but they were young and could not fight off large groups indefinitely. Ryan listened carefully because his military training had taught him to assess situations quickly, and he could tell she was telling the truth, or at least believed she was, and there was something about her that made him want to trust her, even though they had just met. He asked what kind of treasure she was protecting and why she had been waiting in this specific location instead of trying to find a way off the planet and back to her own people. Lyra gestured for him to come closer, and when he did, Storm, the larger dragon with midnight blue scales, moved forward and nudged his hand with its nose, and the touch sent a warm, tingling sensation up his arm that was not unpleasant shadow. The slightly smaller dragon with black scales circled around behind him, and Ryan felt surrounded, but not threatened because these creatures radiated intelligence and curiosity, rather than hostility. Lyra explained that the treasure she guarded was called the Heart of Aelor, and it was not gold or jewels but something far more valuable, and it contained the concentrated life essence of her dying homeworld, and if used correctly, it could terraform dead planets and bring life to barren moons, but in the wrong hands it could also be weaponized to drain life from thriving worlds and leave them as empty husks, which was why treasure hunters and military factions were desperate to find it. She said she had been waiting because the prophecies of her people spoke of a warrior who would return when certain stars aligned, and this warrior would have fought in great battles but still retained a pure heart, and together they would decide the fate of the heart. Aelor. Ryan almost laughed because he did not feel like anyone special, and certainly not like someone from a prophecy, but he had learned during the war that the universe was far stranger than anyone imagined, and dismissing impossible things was foolish. He asked why she thought he might be this warrior from her prophecy, and Lyra stepped closer until they were only a few feet apart, and she said her dragons could sense the nature of people, and they approved of him immediately, which was rare. She also said she could see the weight he carried in his eyes and the exhaustion that came from fighting for something bigger than yourself, and the loneliness of returning to find nothing left of your old life. Ryan felt exposed because she had described exactly how he felt, and he wondered if her people had telepathic abilities or if she was just exceptionally perceptive. Storm made that musical sound again, and Shadow pressed against Ryan's leg, and he reached down to touch the dragon's head and felt that same warmth flowing through him. Lyra said they needed to leave this place soon because her enemies were closing in, and she had felt their presence growing stronger over the past few days. And if Ryan wanted to help her protect the Heart of Aelor and perhaps find a new purpose, he should come with her now. Ryan looked around at the ruins and the refugees and the empty life waiting for him if he stayed, and then he looked back at Lyra and her dragons and made his decision in that moment. He said he would help her because he had spent 3 years destroying things, and maybe it was time to protect something instead, and maybe this strange woman and her dragons and her impossible treasure were exactly what he needed. Lyra smiled with relief when Ryan agreed to help her, and she reached out to touch his shoulder, and her hand was cool against his skin, but not cold, and there was energy flowing from her touch that made him feel more awake and alert than he had. In months, she told him they needed to move quickly because her enemies had scouts in the area, and they would attack as soon as they confirmed her location, and the Heart of Aelor would be vulnerable during transport, so they had to be smart about their route. Ryan asked where exactly they were going, and Lyra explained that the heart was hidden in an ancient cavern system beneath the old city, and her people had built structures on many worlds thousands of years ago, and these places were designed to protect sacred objects. The entrance was several miles away through the most damaged part of the settlement, and they would have to travel mostly at night to avoid being seen, and Storm and Shadow would scout ahead to warn them of any danger. Ryan said he had combat experience and weapons training, but his rifle had been confiscated when he was discharged from military service, and all he had was a standard issue knife and whatever he could improvise. Lyra told him not to worry, because she had weapons that would make his military equipment look like primitive tools, and she would share them once they were safely away from the refugee camp, and drawing attention now would only put innocent people at risk. They waited until full darkness before leaving, and Ryan noticed how Lyra moved through the shadows like she was part of them, and her armor seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the dragons were completely silent despite their size. The first part of Their journey was relatively easy because they stayed in areas Ryan knew well from before the war, and he guided them through collapsed buildings and around unstable structures, and twice they had to hide when patrol drones passed overhead. Lyra whispered that the drones were not looking for them specifically, but they were programmed to report unusual activity, and she did not want anyone asking questions about why a human soldier was traveling with an alien woman and 2 dragons. After about 2 hours of careful movement, they reached the edge of the old industrial district, and this was where things got dangerous because scavengers operated here looking for valuable technology and materials, and some of them were violent. Ryan heard voices ahead, and he signaled for Lyra to stop, and they crouched behind a fallen wall while he listened, and he counted at least 4 people, maybe 5, and they were arguing about territory and salvage rights. Storm and Shadow moved forward silently and positioned themselves on either side of the group, and Ryan could see the dragons in the moonlight, and they looked like living shadows with glowing eyes. Lyra touched Ryan's arm and gestured that they should go around, but before they could move, one of the scavengers spotted them and shouted an alarm, and suddenly the night erupted with movement. The scavengers had weapons, and they started shooting without asking questions, and Ryan pulled Lyra down as energy blasts scorched the air above their heads, and he cursed because this was exactly what they wanted to avoid. But then Storm and Shadow acted, and the dragons moved faster than Ryan thought possible, and they were among the scavengers before anyone could react properly, and the musical sounds they made turned into something fierce and intimidating. The dragons did not kill anyone, but they knocked weapons away and pinned people to the ground with their clawed feet, and within seconds the fight was over, and the scavengers were running away in terror. Ryan stood up slowly and checked to make sure Lyra was unhurt, and she brushed dust off her armor and looked annoyed rather than scared, and she said they needed to move faster now because those scavengers would tell everyone what they saw. They ran through the industrial district with the dragons flanking them, and Ryan's lungs burned because he was not as fit as he used to be, and 3 years of military rations had not done his body any favors. Lyra seemed tireless, and she moved with grace even at a full run, and Ryan wondered what her people were like and if they were all as strong and fast as she was. After another hour, they reached an area Ryan did not recognize because the bombing had changed the landscape completely, and entire streets had collapsed into sinkholes and new hills had formed from piled rubble. Lyra stopped and closed her eyes and seemed to be sensing something, and then she pointed toward what looked like a solid wall of debris and said the entrance was behind that and they would need to dig. Ryan asked if she was sure because it looked like tons of concrete and metal, and they did not have equipment to move all that, and it would take days by hand. But Lyra smiled and called Storm forward, and the dragon approached the debris wall and opened its mouth, and Ryan expected fire, but instead a beam of concentrated energy shot out, and the debris began to melt and flow away like water. Within minutes, they had a tunnel large enough to walk through, and Lyra led the way with her hand glowing to provide light, and Ryan followed with Shadow bringing up the rear. The tunnel went deep into the earth, and the air grew cooler, and Ryan could hear water dripping somewhere, and the sound echoed strangely, and after what felt like forever, they emerged into a massive chamber. The cavern was enormous, and the walls were covered with symbols that glowed faintly blue, and the ceiling disappeared into darkness high above, and in the center of the chamber on a raised platform sat a sphere of pure light. The heart of Alor was beautiful and terrible at the same time, and it pulsed like a living heartbeat, and waves of energy radiated from it, and Ryan could feel it in his bones and in his soul. He understood immediately why people would kill for this, because even looking at it filled him with feelings of hope and possibility, and he could imagine dead worlds blooming with life and barren deserts turning into forests. Lyra walked toward the heart slowly and reverently, and she said this was what her people had died to protect, and this was the last gift from their dying world, and whoever controlled it could reshape entire planets. Ryan asked what she planned to do with it, and Lyra said she wanted to use it to heal worlds damaged by war and create sanctuaries for refugees and outcasts and anyone seeking a second chance at life. But before she could explain further, the chamber shook, and dust fell from the ceiling, and Storm and Shadow roared in warning, and Ryan knew without being told that they had been followed. Armed figures emerged from the tunnel they had just used, and more appeared from passages Ryan had not noticed, and there were at least 20 of them, and they all had weapons pointed at Lyra. And the Harda woman stepped forward, and she wore expensive armor and carried a plasma rifle, and she said she represented the Caney Corporation, and they had been searching for the heart of Alor for years. She told Lyra to step away from the artifact and surrender peacefully, and no one would be hurt, and the corporation would put the heart to good use developing new colony worlds. Lyra refused and said the corporation would weaponize it and drain existing worlds to terraform new ones for profit, and she would die before letting that happen. The woman sighed and said she was hoping to avoid violence, but her orders were clear, and she raised her rifle, and Ryan knew he had to act fast. He dove toward Lyra as the first shots were fired and the chamber exploded into chaos and energy blasts, lit up the darkness like lightning, and Storm and Shadow launched themselves at the attackers with terrifying speed. Ryan had no weapon, but he grabbed a fallen rifle and started returning fire, and he fell back on his military training and years of combat experience, and he moved through the battle like it was second nature. Lyra produced weapons from somewhere in her armor, and they looked like crystal blades, but they cut through metal like paper, and she fought with grace and precision, and together with her dragons they held the entrance to the platform, but there were too many attackers and they kept coming, and Ryan knew they could not hold out forever, and he shouted to Lyra asking if there was another way out. She said there was, but they would have to activate the heart and use its power to open a portal, and that would attract every treasure hunter and military force within 100 miles. Ryan said they did not have a choice because staying here meant capture or death, and Lyra nodded and told him to cover her while she worked. He positioned himself between her and the attackers, and fired controlled bursts and tried to make every shot count, and Storm and Shadow formed a living barrier, and their scales deflected most of the incoming fire. Lyra placed her hands on the heart and began chanting in a language Ryan did not understand, and the sphere began to glow, brighter and brighter until it was almost painful to look at. The chamber filled with light and energy, and reality seemed to bend and twist, and Ryan felt like he was being pulled apart and put back together, and then suddenly everything went white. When Ryan opened his eyes, he was lying on smooth stone, and the air smelled different, cleaner and sweeter than the polluted atmosphere of the settlement, and he sat up slowly, checking himself for injuries, but found none. Lyra was kneeling nearby, with her hands still on the heart of Alor, and the sphere had stopped glowing so brightly, and now it pulsed with a gentle rhythm like a sleeping heartbeat, and Storm and Shadow stood guard on either side, looking alert. But calm. Ryan looked around and realized they were no longer in the cavern beneath the old city, but somewhere completely different, and they stood on a platform of white stone surrounded by ancient pillars carved with the same glowing symbols he had seen before. Beyond the platform stretched a landscape that took his breath away, because rolling hills covered in silver grass led to forests with trees that had leaves in shades of blue and purple, and in the distance mountains rose toward a sky that had 2 moons visible, even though it was daytime. Lyra stood and turned to face him, and she looked tired but also relieved, and she explained that the heart had transported them to a sacred site on a world called Sanctuary, and her people had established this place thousands of years ago as a refuge. Ryan asked if they were safe here, and Lyra said they were safer than before but not completely secure, because the Caney Corporation had tracking technology, and they would eventually figure out where the portal led, but they had time now to rest and plan, and most importantly, they could begin the work of awakening Sanctuary, because this world had been dormant for centuries, waiting for someone to use the heart properly. She explained that Sanctuary was designed to be a living world that could heal itself and grow stronger over time, and it would provide food and shelter and protection for anyone who came here seeking peace. Ryan walked to the edge of the platform and looked out over the strange, beautiful landscape, and he asked how a world could be dormant, and what exactly did she mean by awakening it. Lyra joined him and pointed to the forests and said they were not really alive yet, but rather in a state of preservation, and the same was true for the water, systems, and the atmosphere, and everything was waiting for the heart to give it true life. She said the process would take several days, and she would need to establish connection points across the planet where the heart's energy could flow, and Ryan would need to help her because the Guardians were meant to work in pairs. Ryan felt overwhelmed because this was so far beyond his experience, and he was just a mechanic who had become a soldier, and now he was supposed to help awaken an entire planet. But Lyra touched his hand and said he had already proven himself worthy by fighting to protect the heart, and by choosing to help, rather than run away, and her dragons trusted him, which was the highest recommendation. Her people recognized Storm, and Shadow moved closer and pressed against him from both sides, and their warmth was comforting. And Ryan realized he had started to think of them as friends rather than dangerous animals. He agreed to help because what else could he do? And Lyra smiled and said they would start by exploring the immediate area and finding the first connection point, which should be in the ancient city at the base of this plateau. They descended from the platform using stairs carved into the cliff face, and the stone was worn smooth from thousands of years of use, and Ryan wondered who had walked here before and what had happened to Lyra's people. He asked her about it, and Lyra's expression became sad, and she explained that the Alory had been a thriving civilization once, but they made mistakes and their homeworld began to die because they took too much from it without giving back. The heart of Alor was created as a last desperate attempt to save their world. But it was too late, and instead they decided to use it to create new worlds where others could live in balance with nature. Most of her people died with their homeworld, and only a few hundred survived as guardians scattered across the galaxy, protecting the sacred sites and waiting for the day when they would be needed again. Ryan said he was sorry for her loss, and Lyra thanked him and said it was a long time ago, and she had made peace with it. But sometimes she felt lonely being one of the last of her kind. The ancient city at the base of the plateau was magnificent, even in ruins, and buildings made of the same white stone rose. Several stories high and wide streets were paved with colored tiles that formed intricate patterns. Trees had grown through some of the structures, and vines covered walls, and Ryan thought it looked like a place from a dream or a fantasy story. Lyra led him to the center of the city where a fountain stood dry and cracked, and she said this was the first connection point, and they needed to restore the water flow to activate it. She placed the heart of Alor in a depression at the fountain's base, and it fit perfectly, and immediately began to glow brighter, and energy flowed outward through channels carved in the ground. Ryan watched in amazement as the fountain began to fill with water that sparkled like liquid crystal, and plants around the square started to grow and bloom, and the air became filled with sweet fragrance. Storm and Shadow leaped into the fountain and played in the water like puppies, and their joy was infectious, and Ryan found himself laughing for the first time in years. Lyra laughed too, and her whole face lit up, and in that moment, Ryan realized he was developing feelings for her that went beyond friendship or partnership. But he pushed those thoughts away because they had work to do, and he did not know if Alory even had romantic relationships with other species, and the last thing he wanted was to make things awkward. Over the next several days they traveled across Sanctuary, finding and activating connection points, and with each one the world became more alive and vibrant. Forests began to truly grow, and animals started appearing, and Ryan had no idea where they came from, but Lyra said they were part of the world's design, and they had been sleeping in stasis waiting for activation. They saw creatures like deer but with scales instead of fur, and birds with 4 wings that sang in harmonies, and predators that looked fierce but seemed content to watch them pass without attacking. At night they camped under the stars and talked about their lives and their hopes, and Ryan learned that Lyra loved music and ancient poetry, and she had a wicked sense of humor that surprised him. She learned that Ryan had once dreamed of being an explorer before the war, and that he loved working with his hands and fixing broken things, and that he missed his family even though they were gone. Storm and Shadow slept near them, and sometimes Ryan would wake up to find one of the dragons curled against his back, providing warmth and comfort. On the 5th day they reached the last connection point at the top of the highest mountain, and the climb was difficult, but the view from the summit was worth every painful step. They could see almost the entire planet spread out below them, and it was beautiful beyond words, and Ryan understood why Lyra's people had dedicated their lives to protecting these places. Lyra activated the final connection point, and the heart of Alor blazed with brilliant light and energy spread across the world in visible waves, and Ryan felt the planet come fully awake around them. The air hummed with life and power, and he could sense the world's consciousness like a vast presence that was aware of them and grateful for their work. Lyra explained that Sanctuary was now ready to accept refugees and anyone seeking a new start, and they could open portals from other worlds and bring people here who needed safety and hope. Ryan asked if that meant their work was done, and Lyra said this was just the beginning, because now they needed to defend Sanctuary from those who would exploit it, as if summoning them with her words. The sky above the mountain darkened, and ships emerged from nowhere, and Ryan recognized the insignia of the Kane Corporation. There were at least a dozen vessels, and they were armed for war, and Lyra grabbed the heart and held it close and told Ryan they needed to get back to the city where defensive systems were located. But before they could move, the ships opened fire and explosions tore through the mountaintop, and Ryan grabbed Lyra and pulled her behind a boulder, and Storm and Shadow roared in defiance. Energy beams scorched the ground around them, and Ryan knew they were trapped, and he looked at Lyra and saw fear in her eyes for the first time since they met. He told her they would find a way out of this, and she nodded, but he could see she did not believe him, and the ships kept coming closer and their weapons charged for another attack. Ryan's mind raced trying to think of a plan, and then he remembered something from his military training about defensive positions and terrain advantages, and he told Lyra to trust him. He pointed to a narrow path that led down the backside of the mountain and said they could use it to reach cover, and the ships were too big to follow effectively. Lyra agreed, and they ran with dragons flanking them, and energy blasts chased them down the mountain, and rocks exploded around them, and Ryan felt certain they would not make it. But then Storm did something amazing, and the dragon turned and unleashed that concentrated energy beam directly at the nearest ship and the vessels. Shields flickered and failed. Shadow joined in, and together the dragons created a barrage that forced the ships to pull back temporarily, and that gave them enough time to reach the tree line below. They dove into the forest and kept running, and behind them they could hear the ships hovering and searching, and they knew it was only a matter of time before they were found. Ryan led them deeper into the forest, following paths that only animals had used, and behind them the sound of ships grew quieter. But he knew the Kane Corporation would not give up easily, and they would send ground troops to hunt them. Lyra held the heart of Alor close to her chest, and its glow had dimmed as if it was trying to hide itself. And Storm and Shadow moved silently through the trees, and their scales had darkened to match the shadows. After an hour of hard running, they reached a river, and Ryan suggested they follow it downstream because the water would mask their heat signatures and make tracking more difficult. They waded through the cold water, and Ryan was soaked and exhausted, but he kept moving because stopping meant capture, and he had seen what corporations did to valuable assets, and he would not let that happen to Lyra. She stayed close to him, and he noticed she was limping slightly, and when he asked if she was hurt, she said a piece of shrapnel had cut her leg during the attack. But it was not serious. Ryan insisted on checking, and when he examined her leg, he found a deep gash that was bleeding, and he tore strips from his shirt and bandaged it as well as he could and told her they needed to find shelter so she could rest. Lyra protested that they needed to keep moving, but Ryan was firm and said she would not help anyone if she collapsed from blood loss, and finally she agreed. They found a cave hidden behind a waterfall, and it was small but dry, and Storm and Shadow positioned themselves at the entrance to stand guard, and Ryan helped Lyra sit down and propped her leg up. He wished he had proper medical supplies, but all he could do was make sure the wound was clean and the bleeding had slowed, and Lyra thanked him for his care and said he would make a good healer. Ryan laughed bitterly and said he had spent 3 years learning how to hurt people, not heal them. And this was probably the first truly helpful thing he had done since the war ended. Lyra reached out and took his hand and told him he was wrong, because everything he had done since meeting her had been helpful and brave and kind, and he should not diminish his own worth. Her words struck something deep inside him, and Ryan felt emotion rising in his throat, and he had to look away, because he had not cried since his family died, and he was not about to start now. But Lyra squeezed his hand and said it was okay to feel things and to grieve and to be afraid, and that holding everything inside would only poison him eventually. Ryan found himself talking about things he had never told anyone, and he described the battles he had fought and the friends he had lost and the guilt he felt about surviving when so many others had not. He talked about coming home to find everything destroyed and the emptiness of having no purpose and no place to belong, and how meeting her had given him something to care about again. Lyra listened without interrupting, and when he finally fell silent, she shared her own pain about losing her world and her people and the loneliness of being a guardian with no one to guard alongside. She said meeting Ryan had changed everything for her too, because for the first time in years, she did not feel alone, and she had started to hope that maybe there could be more to life than just duty and obligation. Ryan looked at her in the dim light filtering through the waterfall, and he saw how beautiful she was, and how strong and how vulnerable. And before he could stop himself, he leaned forward and kissed her. Lyra froze for a moment, and Ryan started to pull back, thinking he had made a terrible mistake. But then she kissed him back, and her lips were soft and warm, and the kiss was gentle and perfect. When they finally separated, they were both breathing hard, and Lyra smiled and said she had been hoping he would do that, and Ryan laughed and said he had been terrified she would reject him. They sat together holding hands and talking quietly, and outside Storm and Shadow made contented sounds as if they approved. And for a little while Ryan forgot about the danger they were in. But reality returned when Shadow suddenly growled a warning and Storm joined in, and Ryan heard voices approaching and the sound of heavy boots on stone. He moved to the cave entrance and peered around the waterfall and saw at least 10 soldiers in corporate armor sweeping the area with scanning equipment, and they were getting closer. Ryan retreated back into the cave and told Lyra they had been found, and she struggled to stand, but her injured leg would not support her weight properly, and she nearly fell. He caught her and said she needed to stay hidden with the heart while he and the dragons drew the soldiers away, and once they were clear, she could use the heart to create a portal and escape. Lyra refused absolutely and said they would stay together or not at all, and she would not let him sacrifice himself for her. Ryan argued that it was the only way, and if the corporation captured the heart, everything they had worked for would be lost, and she had to survive to protect Sanctuary. But Lyra was equally stubborn, and she said there was another option, and she could use the heart to awaken the planet's defenses, but it would require enormous energy, and she was not sure she could control it. Ryan asked what would happen if she could not control it, and Lyra admitted that the defensive systems might target everyone, including them, and there was a real chance they would not survive. He considered this and decided it was better than certain capture, and he told her to do it, and he would help however he could. Lyra positioned the heart on the cave floor and placed her hands on it and began chanting in her native language, and the sphere began to pulse with increasing intensity. Ryan felt energy building in the air, and his hair stood on end, and Storm and Shadow moved closer to Lyra, as if adding their own power to hers. The soldiers reached the waterfall and shouted for them to surrender, and when there was no response, they prepared to enter, and Ryan picked up a large rock ready to fight with whatever he had. But then the ground began to shake, and trees throughout the forest started to move, and their branches became like arms, and their roots tore free from the earth. The soldiers screamed as the forest itself attacked them, and trees grabbed weapons and crushed armor, and vines wrapped around legs and pulled people down. Ryan watched in amazement as Sanctuary defended itself, and the trees were not mindless but seemed to understand who was friend and who was enemy. Within minutes, the soldiers were either fleeing or unconscious, and the forest returned to its normal state, and Lyra collapsed backward, and Ryan caught her. She was pale and trembling, and Ryan could see the effort had drained her completely, and he held her close and told her she had done amazingly, and they were safe now. Lyra smiled weakly and said she had never attempted anything like that before, and she was not sure she could do it again. And Ryan said hopefully she would not have to. Storm and Shadow nuzzled Lyra gently, and their touch seemed to restore some of her energy, and after a few minutes she was able to sit up on her own. Ryan helped her move to a more comfortable position, and he checked her leg wound and was relieved to see it had not reopened during the excitement. They stayed in the cave for several hours, while Lyra recovered her strength, and Ryan kept watch, and he saw more corporate ships flying overhead, but they seemed to be leaving, rather than searching. Lyra explained that the forest's defense had probably convinced the corporation that Sanctuary was too dangerous to attack directly, and they would need to regroup and come up with a new strategy. Ryan asked how much time that gave them, and Lyra said maybe a few days or a week at most, and they needed to use that time to strengthen the planet's defenses and possibly call for allies. She said there were other Guardians scattered across the galaxy, and if she could contact them, some might come to help defend Sanctuary. But communication would be difficult without proper equipment. Ryan remembered that the ancient city had technology, and maybe some of it still worked, and Lyra agreed it was worth investigating. When she felt strong enough to travel, they left the cave and made their way back toward the city, moving carefully and watching for any signs of corporate soldiers. The journey took most of the night because they had to go slowly due to Lyra's injury, But finally they reached the white stone buildings as the first sun was rising. The city looked different now that it was fully awakened, and fountains were flowing and gardens were blooming, and Ryan could hear music coming from somewhere. Though he could not identify the source, Lyra led him to a building that looked like a temple or a library, and inside they found walls, covered with screens and displays that flickered to life as they approached. She explained that this was a communication hub, and from here, they could send messages across vast distances and potentially contact other guardians. Ryan watched as she worked with the ancient technology, and her fingers moved across controls with practiced ease, and he realized she must have trained for this her entire life. After about an hour, she made a frustrated sound and said the system was damaged, and she could only send limited messages and there was no guarantee anyone would receive them. Ryan asked if there was anything he could do to help, and Lyra showed him how to repair some of the damaged circuits, and together they worked to restore the system. It took hours of careful work, but finally they managed to get the communication hub functioning at partial capacity, and Lyra sent out distress calls to every Guardian frequency she knew. Then they waited, hoping for a response and wondering if help would come in time. 3 days passed with no response to Lyra's distress calls, and during that time, they worked to strengthen Sanctuary's defenses, and Ryan learned more about the ancient technology than he ever thought possible. Lyra taught him how to interface with the planet's systems and how to direct its natural defenses, and together, they established protective barriers around the city and the most important connection points. Storm and Shadow grew stronger each day as Sanctuary's power increased, and the dragons could now create shields of energy and fly faster than any ship Ryan had seen. At night, he and Lyra would sit on the temple steps and look at the stars and talk about what they would do if they survived, and sometimes they would not talk at all, but just hold each other. Ryan had fallen completely in love with her, and he knew she felt the same way, and it was strange how war and danger had brought them together, but he would not change anything about their journey. On the 4th day, the communication hub suddenly activated and a voice spoke in the Aelori language, and Lyra rushed to respond, and her face showed hope for the first time in days. She explained to Ryan that 3 Guardians had received her message and they were coming to help defend Sanctuary, but they were several days away, and the Caney Corporation might attack again. Before reinforcements arrived, Ryan said they would hold as long as they could, and maybe they could negotiate with the corporation, or convince them that Sanctuary was too dangerous to be worth the effort. Lyra shook her head and said corporations like Caney did not negotiate. They only understood profit and force, and the heart of Aelor represented unlimited wealth and power, and they would never stop trying to take it. Ryan asked if there was a way to destroy the heart to keep it out of their hands, and Lyra looked horrified and said destroying it would kill Sanctuary and probably cause damage to surrounding space. She said the heart was alive in its own way, and it was connected to everything on this planet, and removing it or destroying it would be like ripping out the world's soul. Ryan understood and said they would find another way, and they spent the rest of the day preparing for the inevitable attack. On the 6th day, the corporate fleet returned, and this time there were more ships, and they came prepared for Sanctuary's defenses with shields that could withstand the forest's attacks. Lyra and Ryan stood on the temple platform with Storm and Shadow beside them, and watched the ships descend, and they knew this would be their final stand. The lead ship landed in the city square, and soldiers poured out along with mechs and heavy weapons, and at the center of the formation walked the same woman who had confronted them in the cavern. She called out that they were surrounded and outgunned, and surrender was their only option, and the corporation would be generous if they cooperated. Lyra shouted back that they would never surrender, and Sanctuary would defend itself against anyone who tried to exploit it. The woman sighed and gave an order, and the soldiers advanced, and the battle began. Ryan had never seen anything like what happened next, because the entire city came alive to defend itself, and stones from buildings flew through the air like missiles, and vines erupted from the ground to entangle soldiers. Storm and Shadow took to the sky and attacked the ships with energy beams that burned through armor, and Lyra wielded weapons made of pure light and moved through enemies like a dancer. Ryan fought with a rifle he had taken from a fallen soldier, and his military training guided his actions, and he provided cover fire for Lyra and directed defensive systems through his mental link with the planet. But there were too many enemies, and they kept coming, and mechs tore through the city's defenses and heavy weapons, destroyed ancient buildings, and Ryan knew they could not hold much longer, called to Lyra and told her they needed to retreat to the temple where they could make a final stand. And she agreed, and they fought their way back with dragons covering their escape. Inside the temple, they sealed the doors, and Lyra placed the heart of Aelor at the center of the main chamber, and said if the corporation broke through, she would release all its energy at once. Ryan asked what that would do, and she said it would probably destroy everyone, including them. But at least the corporation would not get what they wanted. He held her close and said he was glad he had met her, and she said she felt the same way. And they kissed one more time while outside. The soldiers tried to break down the temple doors. Storm and shadow pressed against them, and the four of them stood together ready to face whatever came next. But then something unexpected happened because the sky above the temple turned bright with new ship arrivals, and these vessels bore the markings of the Aelori Guardians. 3 ships landed in the city square, and Aelori warriors emerged, and they moved with the same grace as Lyra. And they carried weapons that made the corporation's technology look primitive. The lead guardian was a tall man with silver hair and armor that shimmered like starlight, and he called out to Lyra by name and said they had come to honor their oaths. Lyra ran from the temple with tears streaming down her face and embraced the guardian, and they spoke rapidly in their language, and then she turned and gestured for Ryan to join them. She introduced him as her partner and the one who had helped her awaken Sanctuary, and the guardian studied Ryan for a long moment, and then nodded with what looked like approval. Together the guardians and the awakened planet pushed back the corporation's forces, and the battle turned decisively, and within an hour the corporate soldiers were retreating to their ships. The woman who led them shouted threats about returning with a larger fleet, but the Yastar head guardian laughed and said no fleet would be large enough because Sanctuary was under the protection of the Aelori now. The corporate ships fled, and the city fell quiet, except for the sound of water flowing in fountains and birds singing in trees, and Ryan felt exhaustion wash over him. He sat down on the temple steps, and Lyra sat beside him, and Storm and Shadow collapsed nearby. And for a while, nobody spoke. The head guardian, whose name was Kale, approached and said they had much to discuss about Sanctuary's future and the protection of the heart. But first everyone needed rest. He said other guardians would arrive over the coming weeks, and they would establish a permanent presence here, and Sanctuary would become a refuge for people from all worlds who sought peace. Lyra asked if that meant she could stay here instead of wandering alone, and Kale said of course. And she had done her duty beyond anyone's expectations, and she had earned the right to rest. Then he looked at Ryan and asked what his plans were, and Ryan said he wanted to stay with Lyra if she would have him and help build something good here. Kale smiled and said, humans were not usually chosen as guardians, but exceptions could be made for those who proved themselves worthy, and Ryan had certainly done that. Lyra took Ryan's hand and said she wanted him to stay more than anything, and together they could help refugees settle on Sanctuary and protect this world for future generations. Ryan agreed and felt something settle in his chest, and he realized it was peace and purpose and belonging, and all the things he thought he had lost forever. Over the following months, Sanctuary grew into a thriving community, and refugees from dozens of worlds arrived, seeking safety, and Ryan helped them build homes and establish farms and create new lives. Lyra worked with the other guardians to strengthen the planet's defenses and establish communication networks and create treaties with neighboring systems. Storm and Shadow grew to full size and became symbols of Sanctuary's strength, and children from all species would play with the dragons, and the creatures were gentle despite their power. Ryan and Lyra were married in a ceremony that blended human and Aelori traditions, and guardians and refugees celebrated together, and it was a day of joy and hope. Sometimes at night, Ryan would stand on the temple steps and look out over the city with its glowing fountains and thriving gardens and diverse population. Living in harmony, Lyra would join him and lean against his shoulder, and they would watch the two moons rise and listen to the music of their adopted world. He thought about how he had returned from war expecting nothing, and instead found love and purpose and a home among the stars. The journey had been difficult and dangerous, but every moment had been worth it, because he had helped create something beautiful and lasting. Sanctuary stood as proof that destruction did not have to be the end, and that broken people could heal and build new lives together. And as long as he and Lyra protected this world, It would remain a beacon of hope for everyone who needed a second chance. The future was uncertain because threats would always exist, but they would face them together with their dragons and their friends and their unshakable faith in what they had built. Ryan had found his place in the universe, and he knew with absolute certainty that he would spend the rest of his life defending it and the woman he loved and the dream they had made real.